meeting is being recorded. Got it. Right. So thank you everybody for joining us. It's always a pleasure to come back and speak to the ARC. Still remember my first talk in 2001, no, 2002. That's pre-Bishma era, a long time ago. And but this time, unlike that talk, I have results. And I'd like to share with you the some of the results of a 5-year long project that I've been involved in with my colleague Professor Danny Choresh, who is a PTSD expert at Bar-Ilan, and with a wonderful team of grad students and undergrads who have been very helpful, instrumental in getting this project on the road and making sure that it stays on the road even through COVID. And you can imagine that testing PTSD during times of COVID is not an easy task. Something about the framework in which we are working, Paula mentioned socio-emotional functioning, and that's definitely my area of interest academically, but I think that more specifically, this line of work belongs to my clinical research, and the constant collaboration between clinicians and researchers in my team, with the aim of helping the field raise relevant questions to be tested in the lab, and then these answers fed back to the field so that we can provide better solutions, better support for autistic individuals. And what happened to us was that this project actually was initiated following some experience we've had with clients who came to the clinic who showed strong PTSD-like emotional responses. The manifestation, the symptomatology resembled post-traumatic stress disorder, but when they referred to triggers, they often seemed quite minor. So it's not as if they were not relevant for them, and it's not as if these were things that we did not all encounter, or many of us encountered along the way. Things like kids make fun of me, and some experience bullying or cyberbullying, but the effect of these triggers on their continuing well-being, even many years later, was something that we were very curious about, and that from our experience did not feed well into the literature on PTSD. And that's actually what led me to seek the advice of Danny. And he said, well, you know, in DSM-5 now, this is actually more possible to discuss it within the framework of PTSD, because in DSM-5, unlike previous versions, PTSD is defined through exposure to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence, but it does not have to be direct exposure. So you don't have to experience it yourself. You could be a witness. You could be learning that somebody close was exposed to a trauma, or it could be an indirect exposure. For example, if you're serving in life support services or emergency services and was exposed to traumatic events. But what we thought could be of relevant here was that the thing is not, the trigger does not need to be an event that is really dangerous, but it needs to be experienced as life-threatening or threatening. And therefore, it actually fitted well with what our clients felt. They said, regardless of whether this is something that some individuals might see as minor, for us, it felt very strong, even life-threatening. Or self-threatening. And so this framework allowed us to continue exploring it. And when you think about the rest of the characteristics required for a PTSD diagnosis, it involves intrusion symptoms. So you need to have some symptoms involving repetitive thinking or images or dreams of the event, of the threatening event. This is definitely something that we've experienced with these clients. Avoidance symptoms, so avoiding certain areas, places, or experiences that are associated with the event, with the traumatic event. Negative alterations in cognition and mood, so anger outbursts or being very edgy and experiencing related to the event, and alterations in hyperarousal. So we can see startle response in people. We can see definitely see some autonomic arousal symptoms involved, and these are characteristics that we felt belong in the experiences of these clients, which led us to continue exploring it in this project. When you look at the history of trauma and autism, is one thing that was very surprising for us when we started, when we embarked on this journey 5 years ago, was that there was relatively little research done on autism and trauma. And when we had to tell ourselves why, when you went through Google Scholar and all you could find was old psychoanalytic literature, which often related autism to trauma, and you can see some of these accusations, and I do not wish to repeat them. I wasn't sure even if I want to include them in the first place, but that's the history, and that could explain, even though there's no research supporting these claims, could explain why there is little research, or has been little research on trauma and autism for many years. People tried to stay away from these and the negative, the harmful effects that these accusations had on parents and on individuals with autism. When we think about autism more generally with regards to psychiatric co-occurring condition, and I should say I'm using the PC, but also because when you see neurodevelopmental conditions as the foundation, that people have this from birth and then experience life through it, they often gather co-occurring conditions along the way. So anxiety disorders, depression, suicidal ideation, and indeed PTSD could be things that you develop as a result of having a neurodevelopmental condition and meeting the demands and often the bruises society offers you along the way. So when we look at co-occurring conditions, psychiatric co-occurring conditions in autism, we know from the literature there are high rates of co-occurring psychiatric conditions, and the rates range from 65% to 94%, which is a lot. It almost suggests that you'd be struggling to find somebody with autism without a co-occurring condition, especially when we think about adults, so people who have been through enough along the developmental path. When we think about those that are more common, ADHD, anxiety disorders, and depression have been mentioned as the most commonly diagnosed co-occurring conditions. But Meng Chuan actually did us a great favor in mentioning PTSD in 2019. It wasn't there for a long time, but it started, I think, finding its way into the co-occurring psychiatric condition literature in autism. And what we know is that these co-occurring conditions have a long-term effect on the well-being and the adaptive functioning of individuals with autism, which is why it would be definitely important to look more closely into them and find ways to support individuals in their coping with, or even prevent them to begin with. More specifically about trauma exposure in autism, the literature showed us that there's greater vulnerability to negative social events reported by autistic adults, and we know that from Sarah's wonderful work in 2019. But also with children, the research shows that even if they don't have intellectual disabilities, co-occurring intellectual disabilities, but even more so if they do have it, they're at higher risk for maltreatment, for physical, for sexual, and for verbal abuse. And Connor Kearns is actually the leader of one of the groups who is currently heavily involved in studying post-traumatic stress disorder in individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. Another group that actually is involved in it now is in the UK, and it's a group led by Freya Rambal, and I think Francesca Happe is also involved in London. What we also know from the literature is that children with ASD with and without intellectual disabilities are bullied more often than their peers. So if we think about social triggers for PTSD, then there's definitely room for exploration there. And these studies show that higher levels of victimization and bullying are associated with a tendency for anxiety and for sadness and for anger, for hypersensitivity, for self-injury and for psychosomatic symptoms, for stereotype behaviors and for hyperactivity. There was little exploration about PTSD when we started this journey. And as I said, there's more now, gladly. And when we look at past reports on autism PTSD co-occurrence, as I said, then there are several examinations from the early 2000s, and you can see that they range from report of no comorbid PTSD in PDD and OS in 2007 to 17% of PTSD prevalence in an ASD clinic, and through 3%, 7%. So they vary considerably, and I think that it also depends on the kind of research and the kind of the events that they were looking into. I think that the transition to DSM-5 and what I just discussed earlier about the experience of threat rather than the actual threat is a game changer in that sense, and may actually increase the prevalence of PTSD when we think about it in terms of autism and co-occurrence of the two. Our research questions were about autism, but also about autism traits. And we wanted to know if these are more exposed, individuals with autism or higher autistic traits are more exposed to trauma compared to typically developing individuals. We were interested in learning what is perceived as traumatic among autistic individuals. And we had a hypothesis about autistic people experiencing more negative social interactions as traumatic triggers. And we also were interested in differences in PTSD rates between those with and without autism. So would we be able to see differences in the actual manifestation of full PTSD rather than post-traumatic symptoms? I should say from the start that we did not conduct a clinical examination of PTSD. We based on our estimates on a screen or well-established screening of PTSD. And we wondered whether there's a difference in the PTSD profile. So the way the symptoms are manifested in adults with ASD versus typically developing adults. And finally, we wanted to look into some shared underlying mechanisms that may play a role in ASD PTSD comorbidity. And since we have a good ARC tradition, there's also always the question of is there a sex difference? So we started this journey with a theoretical paper that was published in Psychological Trauma that looked at the comorbidity and what we know about comorbidity between co-occurrence between autism and PTSD, and what potential shared mechanisms could be there. And when you look at the literature, it's very interesting to see that there are differences in the brain. So sorry, there are commonalities in the manifestation of the functioning of brain areas in the two conditions. alterations in the functional connectivity of the amygdala, of the prefrontal cortex in both conditions, a dysregulation of the LHPA axis and its functioning, and hippocampal abnormality in both, problems in emotion regulation that are characteristic of both conditions, reduced specificity to autobiographical memory. That was very interesting to examine. Cognitive rigidity that is characteristic of both, internal, stable, and global attribution style, rumination as a potential co-occurring, a potential underlying mechanism of this co-occurrence, as well as increased anger and aggression and a tendency for avoidance. So all of these have been shown in the literature as characteristic of both autism and PTSD, and we had a look at some of them in this study. So at first, after our theoretical examination, we started by exploring PTSD or post-traumatic stress symptoms and autistic traits in neurotypical students. This is a piece of work published in Comprehensive Psychiatry, 2019, I believe. And we had 103 students. As you can see, they came from different academic institutions, but also from 3 different academic fields. So we aim for those who may be higher on autistic traits like engineering or mathematics or physics, those who may be lower on autistic traits like social work or psychology, and those who may be in the mid-range like economics or business. And so these participants came from a variety of levels of income, and as you can see, they had some were married, some were single, some were in a relationship, mostly Jewish, but we were fortunate to have some Christian and Muslim. In Israel is not that easy to find, but we were happy to welcome them in. We actually asked for their report on several measures, the autism spectrum quotient, the AQ that we know well. We relied on its 26 cutoff for clinic referred samples, and stressful and traumatic life events list. So they were asked to note from a list of life events, which event caused the most significant distress for them. And for that event, they were asked to fill out the PCL5, which is a well-established screener for PTSD based on DSM-5 criteria. And for that, a score of 38 or above is the cutoff for clinic referred sample. So these were the 3 fundamental questionnaires. As you'll be able to see later, we've added some more later. And what you can see from this correlation table is that the 2 are kind of medium, maybe even low to medium correlated in some of them, but you can see stronger correlations in areas like hyperarousal and negative mood and cognition alteration. There is some correlations. There are some correlations with re-experience, with intrusion, not so with avoidance, which was interesting, and I should say even slightly surprising, because we thought that avoidance would be very relevant to begin with, but it is consistently less relevant among the autistic traits and even the clinic-related sample, whereas hyperarousal seems to be very relevant, consistently very relevant along the way. I'm kind of giving a teaser before we move on to the next ones. Within the AQ, you can see that the total scores are show better correlations, but also communication and social skills. Interestingly, the attention to detail and the re-experiencing, if we were thinking about autobiographical memory, that was something that we marked for further examination, and maybe I'll say a word about preliminary findings at the end. what we see in this sample is that when we look at the rates of participants with a probable PTSD, so participants who exceeded the cutoff for the PCL5, you can see that those with high autistic traits have a greater proportion of participants who have a probable PTSD according to the PCL5 compared to those with low autistic traits. So we're talking about 40% of participants in the high autistic traits and 14.7% among those in the, sorry, wrong one. Here, 20% in the PCL cutoff scored up above the cutoff for PTSD. And from these 21 participants, most of them came from the high autistic trait group. And we also had 8 participants. This is a neurotypical group. We also had 8 participants who met the cutoff of the AQ for autism. But obviously that's not enough for us to look more closely into the manifestation of PTSD clusters in autism versus non-autism group. We'd be looking into that later with the clinical group. There was a marginally significant difference in the rates of exposure to potentially traumatic events. So these were classical events that I mentioned earlier, not the social events that we were interested in. So that was a tendency that felt interesting, but then we wondered whether we should add in some more social events, and we will do that with the clinical group later. And as you can see, 40% of the participants in the higher AQ quartile met the PCA cutoff for PTSD, compared to only 40.7% among those in the 3 lower AQ quartiles. So definitely those with higher AQ scores are more likely to have PTSD compared to those with lower AQ scores. Here is a breakdown of the different subscales of the AQ, comparing those who met the cutoff for PTSD versus those who did not. And you can see that there are differences in the AQ total score, but also in social skills, in attention switching, and in communication. So there is room to suggest that high autistic traits may also be associated with higher prevalence for PTSD. We were then encouraged by these findings. We were then we went on to test a clinical group. This is a paper that was published last year in Autism, and for that group, we also wanted to examine not just the classical triggers, but also the social triggers, and see whether these actually bring us better, differentiate better between the groups if we rely on them versus the classical PTSD triggers. So we had 25 people in each group. As you can see, they were comparable on several factors. And there is a difference in education here. I should say income, that was something that one of the reviewers said, I was surprised to see that they don't vary on income. And that was because we asked about the household income, and some of those in both groups actually still lived with their parents. And so household income may have been unaffected and did not necessarily suggest that the person with autism themselves had a high income. The inclusion criteria here was a formal diagnosis of ASD for the ASD group, no intellectual impairment from a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, and the recognition of the diagnosis by the Ministry of Welfare and National Insurance Service. So we were not able to administer a measure like the ADOS with all these participants, but that was stamped by the state that these adults are accepted as autistic, and as I said, recognized by, so diagnosed by both a psychologist and a psychiatrist according to the DSM-5 criteria. Our measures involved again the AQ and the stressful life events list, but we also added a wider range of negative social events including bullying and social exclusion, and ostracism from the bullying questionnaire. So we were able to examine whether the more classical PTSD triggers like war or sexual abuse, or the more social negative events as triggers would be associated with PTSD symptoms in each of the groups. What you can see again is that we have a difference between the groups on PTSD symptoms in general. And as you can see again, like we saw in the autistic traits, specifically a strong difference in alteration in hyperarousal. Also, there's also a difference in intrusion, a marginal difference in avoidance. And this was not, the negative alterations in mood and cognition was not significant. 32% of the ASD group met the PCL cutoff for a probable PTSD diagnosis. That's quite a lot when we think about what we saw earlier, compared to only 4% in the typical developing group. So that's quite a difference here. Is there a sex difference? We found an interesting group by gender interaction regarding the PTSD alteration hyperarousal symptoms. So this very interesting cluster of symptoms, of post-traumatic symptoms associated with hyperarousal, show a strong difference for females with ASD versus neurotypical females. No significant difference for males. You can see that there's a tendency that it wasn't significant, but it is definitely significant for females. So higher post-traumatic symptoms of hyperarousal for females with ASD. When we looked at which event they chose as the traumatic event they would like to fill out the PCL for, you can see that there's a mirror image here. Most of the people in the ASD group went for a negative social event. Most of those in the typical developing group went for a classical A criterion event. And that again suggests that within the autism group, PTSD is more associated with social experiences. When we look at the correlations between the two groups, you can see this, it actually marked very strongly here. PTSD criterion A events are correlated with the total PCL score for the typical developing adults, whereas the negative social events, but not the criterion A events, are correlated with the PCL score for the ASD group. And a similar pattern was found for the hyperarousal again. Somewhat for negative alterations in mood and cognition, but that wasn't significant. And again, here for intrusion. So what we get to see is that with more power, we'd be able to see that this difference is actually very vivid across the different clusters for PTSD. And another sex difference, a group by gender interaction regarding the exposure to potentially traumatic social events. So again, when we look at the number of events, the social events mentioned by males versus females in the ASD and TD group, there is a greater number of social events mentioned as traumatic triggers in the ASD group across the board, but this difference is again stronger for females. So they experience more social events as potential PTSD triggers, and they have higher hyperarousal symptoms as a result. When we looked at the severity of PTSD and ASD symptoms as a function of the comorbidity, we wanted to see whether having both actually shows a different manifestation of the PTSD or autism symptoms. We can see that participants with both PTSD and autism reported higher social skill difficulties compared to those who had autism but did not meet the cutoff of PTSD. So having PTSD on top of autism means having greater social skills difficulties. Similarly, participants with both PTSD and autism reported higher PTSD severity. So having both versus having PTSD but no autism meant that you report higher PTSD severity in general and specifically higher intrusion levels compared to those who just had PTSD but no autism. So again, having both conditions does not necessarily mean that, well, actually suggests that you have a more severe picture of both conditions versus having just one of them. The last bit that I'd like to discuss with you is about the mechanisms underlying PTSD and ASD. I'll focus specifically on rumination as one of these mechanisms. This is a piece of work that's currently under minor revisions in autism again. Just to define rumination, we're talking about the focus of our attention on one negative emotional state or life event and repetitively thinking about it, inhibiting any actions that might distract us from this state. So constantly thinking about it, avoiding other things. And this is considered to be an emotion regulation strategy, but it's not often a very productive one or adaptive one. It is likely to be an independent cognitive processing style, and some studies regard it as a separate cognitive processing style, aside from emotion regulation. And within rumination, we can see that the two subclusters are discussed. One is brooding rumination, so continuously thinking about the event, comparing our current condition to the one that we wanted to end up in. I can give you a very fresh example from a client who just presented her work in the area that she's studying, and she did not understand one of the instructions and was requested to resubmit the work. Since she has a condition, she was offered some more time, but she initially got stuck on, why do I have to do this all over again? Why does it happen to me? Why is there injustice, etc., etc. And from other examples, people who spend years writing letters, even as adults, writing letters to the Ministry of Education, complaining about the way they were mistreated as children and suggesting that the system should be changed. Again, I'm not suggesting that they're not right. I'm just arguing that this is an example of a coping mechanism that might not be very adaptive for them. The other kind is reflection rumination, which is an introspective effort to cognitively solve your problems. And when we look at rumination in PTSD literature, increased rumination was found among individuals with PTSD. And if you see a person endorsing rumination shortly after traumatic events, it usually predicts a more probable PTSD later. And brooding and reflection rumination were positively correlated with post-traumatic symptoms, but the findings regarding reflection are inconsistent. So brooding rumination is consistently associated with post-traumatic symptoms, whereas reflective rumination, not so much. When we look at rumination in ASD, we know that repetition is a central component of rumination, and that's actually a defining aspect of autism. And we know that the literature shows there's increased rumination among individuals with ASD, and that this is associated with depressive symptoms, specifically brooding rumination again. So we looked at autism and PTSD and the role of rumination in 34 adults with autism and 66 neurotypicals. Again, comparable on everything but education, and therefore education was covariate for. You can see here, again, the manifestation of PTSD versus no PTSD in the ASD group versus the developing group. And again, the ratio for ASD is similar, around 30%, showing scoring above cutoff for PTSD, for probable PTSD. And when we look at the group differences, again, PTSD total symptoms, intrusion, marginal difference, negative alterations in mood and cognition, and hyperarousal, the strongest difference, but also differences between the groups on rumination, specifically on brooding rumination, marginally on reflection rumination. When we looked at the role these play in a mediation analysis, mediating between having ASD and having PTSD symptoms, that's the total PCL score, you can see that the brooding rumination actually fully mediates the association between group and PTSD symptoms, whereas reflective rumination does not. So getting stuck on this kind of rumination, looking at the discrepancy between your situation and what you wished for, or what you think is right and should be done, suggests you may end up having higher level of PTSD symptoms. So to conclude, autistic individuals face an increased risk for both trauma exposure and PTSD. And social stresses seem to be most notably for females. And that's an area that we are very curious about and would like, of course, to have a closer look with a larger sample and with more females. It may be associated with a unique symptomatic profile of PTSD, but they, again, needs to be further explored. And there's also need for more research on the manifestation of PTSD in autism, as well as in other neurodevelopmental conditions. And as I said, there are a few groups now. There's also a Finnish group that's currently looking into it. Kildal is the name of the first author on many of these publications. So there is room for optimism there'd be more work on that in the coming years. We found a tendency for brooding rumination may exacerbate post-traumatic experiences for autistic individuals up to the point of full-blown PTSD. And there is room for examination of additional mechanisms. In light of what we saw on hyperarousal, I was wondering about the role of sensory sensitivities. I should say that we've collected some data on this, and we're currently analyzing it. So hopefully, if you invite me next year, I'd have some more. Taking this back to the clinic means developing new interventions or adapting existing evidence-based treatments for PTSD, such as prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy, which may be relevant for autistic individuals as well, but also may require some adaptations with the aim of reaching a personalized treatment for autism, for autistic people who have PTSD, maybe even more specifically for autistic females versus males who have PTSD and autism. Just to give you a look at, this is more popular literature, okay? So, but also from journals. This is, can you see it's Lancet? No, it's BMJ, yeah. So there is more interest now in ASD and PTSD co-occurrence. And the other thing that we found, again, taking it back to the clinic, following these publications, this is just a small sample of replies that we've had from people around the world who feel that this really applies to them. And the sad thing was that we did not have anything to offer them clinically at this point, neither at our place nor at theirs. But I do hope that we'd be able to offer more solutions in the near future. In terms of the next phases for this study, expanding the sample, of course, we had to wait for COVID to finish, because otherwise it's really overshadowed by the current experiences, which may be traumatic for all of us. We do have some data on autistic people in terms of their PTSD sample as symptoms throughout COVID, and we're currently working on them. That's very interesting compared to typically developing adults. The other thing that we'd like to explore is the perspective, the unique perspective of those adults. So have some qualitative interviews and see how it is experienced by them, not just through a questionnaire, but also through their own narrative, particularly about the experience of social triggers as triggering post-traumatic symptoms. Continue looking into underlying shared mechanisms. We are looking into autobiographical memory. I promised I'll give a glance. There was an interesting finding about the specificity of autobiographical memory, that whereas we know that in PTSD literature for neurotypicals, the less specific the memory, the higher post-traumatic symptoms you'd have. In autism, it was actually reversed. So the more specific, the more detailed the memory was, the greater level of symptoms, of post-traumatic symptoms that we find. And that's actually, again, suggesting the attention to detail that I've mentioned earlier, maybe playing a role there. But again, we'd need to look more closely into that in the future. As I said, treatment, looking into physiology and biology and the way they play a role in this co-occurrence of conditions, and also taking this down to a younger age group and examining across a wider level of functioning, because these were all adults with no intellectual impairment, co-occurring intellectual impairment. I don't know if you have some time, just another look at some co-occurring, some underlying mechanisms. This is for autistic traits and PTSD association. You can see that trait anger actually differentiates or moderates the autistic trait PTSD association. This is within the student non-clinical group. So those with low autistic traits, there's no difference between high anger and low anger, trait anger on the PCL score. But for the high autistic trait, the more probable autism group, the high anger group showed higher post-traumatic stress symptoms. Similarly, for reframing as an emotion regulation mechanism, we can see that for those who have low reframing, who use reframing less, there is a positive correlation between autistic traits and PTSD avoidance. So we didn't see anything very interesting about avoidance. That was the first time we saw something that is of relevance in terms of an underlying mechanism. So again, something to look for in future examinations. Thank you for listening, and be happy to hear what you think.